Now, I want to start this off by giving a few opening notes about the report itself. Leaders and Laggards is designed to provide an in-depth evaluation of data and careful analysis of post-secondary education performance and policy across states to better inform the business community as well as state policymakers and to advance the debate in important ways. Now, we did this report because according to the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce, more than 2/3 of all of our job openings nationwide will require some form of higher education by the year 2018. Because of that, we're projected to fall short of what we need to fill every one of those available jobs by about 7 million workers. That's going to create an enormous strain on the economy if we don't do something about it. We also did this report because while some post-secondary education credential is quickly becoming a requirement for participation in the labor market, the cost of going to college continues to skyrocket. Some students today are making investments in higher education that exceed what they're going to spend on a home eventually, and yet they can't find simple information about the quality of the education that they will receive. And lastly, we did this report because while students are being forced to pursue and make these investments, employers are becoming increasingly skeptical about the quality of the education students are receiving. They increasingly find that someone with a college diploma doesn't ensure the quality that they need to grow or expand their operations. Simply put, something needs to be done, and it needs to be done now. Now, this report only covers public institutions. It does not cover private schools or for-profit schools, and it excludes military service academies. It does, however, include historically black colleges. Wherever appropriate, we separated the grades and the data out by 2- and 4-year institutions as a reflection of the differing missions in some cases, the differing goals, and in many cases, the differing governance structures. We prepared this report in conjunction with the American Enterprise Institute and Russ Whitehurst of the Brookings Institution. We also consulted an advisory team of leading academics, former university and higher education system officers, and policy experts in the process of writing this report. We didn't ask them to endorse this report. I want to make sure we understand that. Only for them to provide us with guidance, feedback, and criticism of the work we're undertaking. Lastly, if you've ever looked at higher education data for any amount of time, you'll know that it's a total mess. U.S. News and World Report takes a lot of criticism for their ranking of institutions, but there's a reason that they do the grading on what they do, and that's because there's not a lot of great information out there that we can use in a comparable way. This is easily the biggest takeaway from this report, that higher education data and transparency must improve if we're going to make greater improvements going forward. Now, for this report, we did lean heavily on U.S. Department of Education data, as well as data from the Delta Cost Project, the U.S. Census, and some of our own original research. We worked closely with the advisory team to ensure that we were using the best data available in all cases. Now, this report makes 3 overarching recommendations and then 5 more specific recommendations. I'm going to go through them with you before getting into Kentucky's grades category by category. The first is that we need to find solutions that match state priorities. In other words, do no harm above all else. We were very careful throughout the report to not make specific recommendations on what states should do, but to generally guide policymakers and institutions to be more mindful of the investments that they're making in higher education. The second is to embrace transparency. As we talked about, it's very much lacking in higher education, but good decision-making at all levels starts with having the right information and making it public. And lastly, we want to make sure that there's a focus on performance and not just inputs. Too often in higher education, we look at what goes into a school, and U.S. News is a great case in point on that, and we ignore what comes out, or more pointedly, what does not come out of the institutions. This is a mistake that we simply can't afford to continue making. All right, there we go. So on to the specific recommendations, there are 5 of them, and the first is that we need to promote degree completion. States should move away from funding formulas that are based too heavily on student enrollment. Although such policies do ensure greater access to higher education, they neglect the student's success when they actually get to school. Instead, states should require that some portion of each institution's funding is based on making sure that students who enroll actually finish their degrees and do so in a timely manner. States should also set goals for degree attainment that reflect local economic realities. Now, not every state simply needs to double the number of every degree. Some states boast top-of-the-line four-year colleges but have underperforming community colleges, or vice versa. Policymakers would be wise to use their resources and their time dedicated to reforming the institutions that are most in need of it. Lastly, states could improve degree completion by removing obstacles students often face when they wish to transfer student credits from one institution to another. Policymakers should remove uncertainty from this process by requiring that public institutions accept courses from other in-state providers by creating a system of common course numbering and facilitating the movement of credits across 2- and 4-year colleges. And I might note that this is something, and we'll get into it later, that Kentucky actually does very, very well. Second recommendation is to improve measurement of post-secondary education quality. States simply must find better ways to measure not just the quantity of degrees, but the quality of the degrees that are produced. Higher levels of academic attainment will only drive economic growth if students are actually learning something and if those degrees and credentials earned in a state have value in the local labor markets. States should do more to assess student learning in a systematic and comparable way across institutions. Now, only a few states do this now. Kentucky is one of them. And we're not arguing that all institutions should administer the same test or a particular exam, or that it should be a graduation requirement even. However, even within that framework, there's still considerable room to measure student learning and report the results to the public in a way that informs decision-making without infringing upon institutional autonomy. Third, we need to promote efficiency. Now, as you all know, state budgets are having to do more with less, and the demand for access to public education is on the rise. As such, it is widely understood that colleges and universities will need to find ways to do more with less. However, educational leaders and policymakers seldom do the kind of analytical work that is needed to make colleges more productive. We recognize that there are different routes to enhance efficiency. Now, you could either produce more quality degrees for the same amount of money, you could produce, maintain level, you could try to do more with less, but either way you choose, it should be based on local realities and fit the context of the situation. States should also broaden measures of performance to include efficiency metrics such as cost per degree. They should examine how those per unit costs vary across institutions, and they should routinely measure the return on public investments. Fourth, and in my opinion, this is the biggest one, is that we need to improve transparencies. Colleges and universities are far too often reluctant to provide data that would allow consumers to compare their performance with that of other institutions. But consumers need information to make informed decisions about whether enrolling in a particular program is worthwhile. Moreover, taxpayers and business leaders need performance data to hold colleges and universities accountable and to know which institutions are producing graduates with high-quality educations. And lastly, we need to increase openness to innovative education models. Now, we already mentioned that we have to do more with less, but traditional colleges are going to be hard-pressed to do so without introducing new modes of delivery. States should actively test out many important non-traditional initiatives that have been launched over the years. Some of the best-known approaches are online learning and blended learning kinds of programs that present an opportunity to build additional capacity at lower cost while appealing to non-traditional students in search of more flexible class schedules. Some other great models that we've seen out there include competency-based models of education, degree structures that give credit for prior learning, and career-oriented apprenticeship programs. States should also bear in mind that innovation is beginning to take place both inside and outside of traditional institutions, and policymakers should ensure that regulatory barriers do not impede students' access to the diverse array of public and private providers offering these kinds of programs. Now, I'm going to move on to the actual metrics that we grade. And the first one that we talk about is student access and success. So for this category, what we were really interested in is whether or not states were able to retain and graduate a high percentage of their students within a reasonable amount of time, and whether or not they ensure access to low-income students. To do so, we gave grades based on several metrics, and the first is the percentage of undergraduates receiving Pell Grants. Simply put, that's a need-based program, so the percentage of students enrolling at the state's institutions are a good proxy for their commitment to enrolling low-income students. We graded on retention rates because in order for a student to graduate, they have to persist from their first year to their second year. That's a very important first step in the process. We looked at completion rates, of course, because to reap the full return on investment in post-secondary education, students must finish their degree or credential within a reasonable amount of time. We also did a risk-adjusted completion rate. Now, we believe that colleges should be recognized and rewarded for enrolling and graduating low-income students. Raising completion rates by excluding particular students will ultimately do very little to raise overall attainment levels, and is contrary to the goal of what we're trying to accomplish here. So in order to safeguard against that, we developed a metric that measures each state's graduation rate performance after taking into account the percentage of first-time students who receive Pell Grants. This risk-adjusted metric essentially measures how far above or below a state's expected performance in graduating those students is as compared to the number of Pell students they enroll. Finally, we gave out grades in this category and other of our hard data-driven categories based on a standard deviation scale, so there's a fairly even distribution of grades here. But in order to earn either an A or an F, you have to stray pretty far from the national median across the various metrics. Now, as you can see on the map, regionally in this category for two-year performance, the Southeast and the upper Midwest fared pretty well in the two-year category, while the Middle Atlantic and the lower Midwest did pretty poorly. Now, Kentucky, for their two-year student access and success, received a B in this category. The state really stands out in providing access to low-income students, with 67% of its students receiving some form of Pell Grant, and that's well above the national median of 47%. Elsewhere, Kentucky is about at the national median in the other categories for completion and retention. And I just want to note that South Dakota was the leader in two-year completion rates, clocking in at 58%. That's almost 35% points higher than Kentucky, so there's still a lot of room to grow in this category, although you do very well. Now, for four-year student access and success, regionally, the Rocky Mountain states and the Appalachian states fared pretty poorly, while the East Coast seemed to earn their fair share of A's and B's. Kentucky, in particular, earned a D in this category, with a completion rate that's more than 8 points lower than the national median. Now, I do want to note here that the national median is just 54.5%. That's not acceptable by any stretch of the imagination, and it's indicative of a problem that this is a national crisis that we have. We need to do more to make sure that the students we enroll in college are seeing their way through to completion at far higher rates than what we have today. The next metric is efficiency and cost effectiveness. So for this category, we looked at whether or not a state's institutions are providing an adequate return on investment for their higher education spending by looking at how much money schools are spending for each degree they produce. We gave grades based on four metrics. The first is cost per completion, which is simply the total amount an institution spent on education and related expenses in a given year divided by the total number of credentials the institution produced in that year. We also looked at state, local, and tuition funding per completion. So another way to think about cost effectiveness is to consider the return on taxpayer investment in higher education. So how much does it cost the state in terms of appropriations and grants to produce a degree at its public institutions? If a state produces a large number of degrees with a relatively low investment, taxpayers are likely to see that as a good bargain. States that invest much more to produce a similar number of degrees, on the other hand, that may not be as attractive of a deal. Of course, states that invest less money in public education often have to make up this margin by charging higher tuition to students and families. That's something that we don't necessarily want to see happen. Therefore, we also calculated state and local funding per credential by summing up all the appropriations, local appropriations, state appropriations, and then dividing by the weighted sum of degree and certificate completions. We also created a combined metric that was designed to reward states that were efficient on cost per completion and provided a good return on public investment. This measurement rewarded states that were above the national average on both measures and penalized those who lag behind on each. Now, I do want to have a big word of caution here, and it's a very important one. We've already heard from some states that think that they take up this report and they say, well, if we just spend less money in higher education, we're obviously going to do better. That's not what we're saying here. If you slash this budget blindly and you produce far fewer students, this measure will penalize you for that inefficiency that you're creating by not funding at an appropriate level. Similarly, if you spend $1 million more and you produce vastly overproportionate number of degrees because of that money, that's an excellent investment that you're making in higher education. Ultimately, what we want to see is states being more mindful of the investments that they're making and making sure that the investments that they do make have outcomes in mind. So for this metric on 2-year, Kentucky is among the leaders in the nation, and it earns an A in this category. It significantly outperforms the national median across all metrics. Now, it's important to note that this cost per degree metric is heavily linked to completion rates. The better you are at graduating students, the more efficient you are at graduating students, the naturally higher your grade will be in this category. But if you look at the 2-year schools, Kentucky was about average in completion, which would ordinarily mean an average grade here. This is to say that this state's schools are doing a phenomenal job of keeping costs down while still keep graduating an adequate number of students and should be appropriately lauded for their efforts. Now in 4-year, looks like we already moved on a little bit too far. There's not much of a regional trend here to be found anyways at the 4-year level. Of course, it is interesting to note that a lot of the states that did very well in the 2-year category did very poorly in the 4-year category and vice versa. That's likely indicative of the point of emphasis made at the policy level in terms of what they want the state to dedicate themselves to. And Kentucky received a D in this category, and it's above the national median across the board and is significantly higher than the median in state, local, and tuition funding for completion. Here's a case where the numbers do, however, match up pretty well to lower completion rates, which is likely the culprit for much of the inefficiency found here. The next category is meeting labor. Well, did we already go past? Yeah, we did. Sorry about that. Wasn't paying attention to the slides. We're here on meeting labor market demand now. And for this category, we want to know how much better college graduates fare than their less educated peers. So for this, naturally, if you go out and make an investment in higher education, there should be a premium, there should be a reward at the personal level for doing so. So what we did was we constructed 2 different metrics. They break out to a lot more than 2 different metrics, but at the end of the day, it's really 2. What we did was we looked at median wages of degree holders as compared with high school graduates. To construct this measure, we relied on U.S. Census data for the American Community Survey, and we basically looked at median wages for bachelor's or associate's degree holders and compared them to high school people who had just a high school diploma. If they have a premium for earning one of those degrees, naturally your wages should be higher. Similarly, we also looked at the difference in unemployment rates between degree holders at the various levels. Now, Kentucky is actually right at the median for all metrics across both the 2- and 4-year categories, and as such received a C in both 2- and 4-year labor market demand. Moving on to transparency and accountability. So this metric we graded on this category we graded on 4 different metrics. At first, what we believe is that higher education transparency should have 2 distinct objectives. The first is to foster public accountability by providing stakeholders, such as taxpayers, policymakers, and business leaders, with the information on productivity, performance, and the cost of a state's post-secondary education system. So to translate this into a measurable concept, we collected data on whether or not a state had mechanisms to report information about higher education performance and outcomes. The second objective, of course, is to ensure that students and families have the information they need to make informed decisions on their educational future. For this, we asked state officials whether or not the state had developed a mechanism to inform consumers about the costs and the outcomes at colleges and universities within the state. We were particularly interested in assessing what information was made to students on outcomes such as graduation rates, licensure passage rates, or labor market outcomes, and finally the net price to attend these institutions across the state. Since this is for consumers, we felt that this information should be user-friendly and easy to find. To receive credit for targeting consumers, states had to place the information where consumers might reasonably be expected to find it, such as on a state website under headings such as About Our System or Consumer Information. Also, the information could not simply be dumped into a 100-page PDF that no reasonable person is going to sift through to find the information that they need. It had to be in an easily digestible format if you were going to get credit here. Since there are often different governance structures for 2- and 4-year schools, we gave separate grades to each. Kentucky, however, received the exact same score for the same reasons in both of the categories. So Kentucky is a national leader in ensuring that students actually learn something while they're in school, which is definitely something to be proud of. They're one of the few states that take steps to measure student learning. Unfortunately, a lot of that data is not made available to consumers, which is something that we would like to see going forward. The state has a decent public accountability report with a good dashboard reporting system. It could be improved by including better labor market outcomes data. And what we would like to see ultimately is the consumer information piece improve a little bit in order to get a better grade here. And that's the same for both 2 and 4 years. One note I do want to make before we go forward, since our report was released, as with any report like this, it's not a living document. It's something that does have to have a cutoff date as we go through. And shortly after, or very much before we released our report, Kentucky actually published a new online dashboard system that is much better and easier to read than the ones we had to look at the time where we were doing this report. The old university report card listed graduation rates for some but not all institutions, and now it appears that they do a much better job of getting this information out to the public. We're appreciative of their efforts. We apologize that it couldn't have happened before we put out a report, but these things are going to happen whenever you release something like this. This is a snapshot in time. Its targets are always going to move. We know that. So for policy environment, which is the next category, we looked at a few different things. One, we looked at whether or not a state has goals for higher education. To grade this metric, we asked state higher education offices to submit some information to us and point us in the right direction to whether or not they had goals and priorities for the state. We graded on whether or not they actually had goals. Don't laugh. Some states actually do not have any goals whatsoever for higher education. California brazenly says in their own higher education plan specifically that they do not have goals. We also graded on the quality of those goals, meaning are they non-arbitrary or concrete kinds of benchmarks. We also looked at whether or not a state has an outcomes-based funding system. So one popular effort to encourage post-secondary education productivity is to shift away from funding an institution based solely on enrollment to a formula that includes some kind of course or degree completion. I want to be quick to point out that we don't have any specific target or any magic number for what portion of an institution's funding should be based on outcomes. We grade on the existence of an outcomes-based funding model because it demonstrates that legislators are being mindful of outcomes when they're making these investments. And the last thing we look at is credit transfer and articulation. So one of the best ways to improve efficiency in higher education is to facilitate a smooth transfer of credit, since between 1/3 and 1/2 of all students are earning credits at one institution and trying to transfer them into another where they will ultimately earn their degree. Having a smooth system can certainly increase transparency. If you go to the Complete College America's website and look at the report, Time is the Enemy, you'll see that students are earning far, far more credits than what they need to in order to receive a degree, particularly pronounced at the associate's degree level, where most students are earning literally twice as many credit hours as they should need to in order to obtain their credential. So for Kentucky, in this, I want to note here, the grade in the report is a C. We had a bit of a communication issue with between ourselves and the Kentucky Higher Education Office. We did not get feedback from their office as we were producing our report. We looked and we scoured their website trying to find their set of state goals. We didn't find quite what we were looking for, and they got knocked down a few points. Turns out that they do have some concrete targets, and that would have boosted their grade from